All right, so this lesson here will begin the 7th chapter of Amos. And this will be more like an introduction, but we will touch on the first verse. And it'll pick up a little quicker as we start the actual verses next week. But this is just an introduction. And Amos chapter 7, verse 1. Thus the Lord God showed me, and behold, he was forming a locust swarm when the spring crop began to sprout. And behold, the spring crop was after the king's mowing. So the northern kingdom will experience an insect judgment. And when we come to verse 4, next lesson, Israel's judgment will go from insect judgment to judgment by fire. But for this lesson, it's an introduction to the judgment by a locust swarm, an insect judgment. So this insect judgment upon the northern kingdom here has to do with the natural resources. The natural resources that the land and the people experienced as a blessing from God. And as we move along in these verses next week, we'll see that these blessings of resources will be devoured. And if we read the scriptures in their context and follow the biblical patterns of the way God deals with nations that are under judgment, well, it's clear throughout the Bible that God affects those nations' resources, the natural resources. And when a nation was under God's judgment, he would devour those natural resources. And in this case, it was an agrarian society. Crops. It's how people were fed and made their trade. But then they had, as part of their land, natural resources, like water, fertile land, and in many areas of today's world, a predominant natural resource would be like oil. And under God's judgment, these things begin to deplete and get sucked up. Mismanagement is high at the top. And you have men wanting other men to be kings, to be their kings, and govern them. And that's not what God's intention was from the beginning. Even back in the Old Testament era of life, the Lord God was to be king. He's to be the government of humanity. And we don't need to have mere man. The only type of government that was under God, under the Old Covenant, prior to 1 Samuel 8, for instance, when the people started requesting from Samuel, give us a king like all the other nations, well, in doing so, they were rejecting the one true God being their king. So God gives them over to see. This is what it's going to be like. So in 1 Samuel 8, well, they get their king. They got their king, King Saul. And Saul parallels Deuteronomy 17 and does what God said would happen. Because it's within unregenerate men to suck resources dry. Bone dry. Suck them dry. So when God is king, there is no loss of things because they're maintained. But people are sinful. By unchecked, unchanged, unregenerate nature. And desire to make their own way. Aiming and striving to want to be like everybody else. Keeping up with the material and religious most popular. Because they're spiritually blind. And they don't see the benefits, this old covenant Israel. They don't see the benefits of having God as their king. All they see is, and all they covet is, what the surrounding nations have. So they are always looking horizontally in life. The make your own way of horizontal vision. Because they didn't have the ability to see vertically the ways of the one true God. The vertical vision, you see. So they've got what they've got then. So God's going to deal with them here in chapter 7. The one big emphasis in all the Old Testament is that they were dead. They were dead. They couldn't get to God, even by doing all those laws and commandments. And you see, hundreds and hundreds of years, millions and millions of lives came and went in the nation of Israel. And God kept stretching it out. They wanted to obey. They wanted to do good works and live a good life. But that didn't save them, or anyone now for that matter. We are still on the way to the lake of fire. The way today is, secular religion, commercial religion. The way today is, here is my son, here is the gospel, believe on him. And this is much false relief for people. It's relief for them, but it's false relief. It's a whole nother problem, really. It's way too easy. And many think it's just that easy. And it's just that simple. That they don't have to do anything but believe on him. And say with their mouth that Southern Kingdom syndrome kind of thing. That's how people are today. These evangelicals, they call themselves. That are all pomp and show. And that's it. Gotta watch my mouth. I don't want to say anything offensive. So you believe God, but mingle in with other gods and mingle in other gods. So this is just a little introduction to Amos 7, and we'll go over a little bit of the first verse, which we'll touch on next week as well. Amos chapter 7 verse 1. Thus the Lord God showed me, and behold, he was forming a locust swarm when the spring crop began to sprout. And behold, the spring crop was after the king's mowing. Now, locusts are a sign of God's judgment, as in devouring resources of a people. You can look at the book of Joel. Joel used this analogy of God sending judgment. It's signified with locusts. And Joel used it in regards to the Babylonians who pilfered, the Babylonians who pillaged the southern kingdom's resources. But of course, later on in the book of Joel, in the 2nd chapter, God made promise to restore the years that the locusts had eaten. From them, some translations of locust say the cankerworm. So God's bringing judgment here to the northern kingdom in a loss of resources. And it had a tremendous weight put on that government and economy. And that's the beginning of God's judgment on a people group. So there's a locust swarm when the spring crop began to sprout. And the spring crop was after the king's mowing. So the judgment came just as the crop began to sprout, began to germinate. And many of you have planted cucumbers. Many of you have planted bed of radishes, radish seeds, scattered them out there. And a couple weeks later, you can see a green haze over where you cultivated and seeded. And it looks as if, well, everything germinated. And it'll be a bumper crop, right? So Amos says the locust swarm formed when the spring crop began to sprout. So God through Amos is saying, well, everything's looking good in the fields. You see, the northern kingdom was worshiping multiple gods in their compromised religion, God and Baal. Everything looked good, growing along just fine, right? Think of the time of Noah. Everything was fine, right? Until Noah and his family entered the boat, the door was shut and disaster struck. Everything was great until God shut that door. See, Jesus used this same analogy in Matthew 24. Everything was great. Everything was just fine. Eating, drinking, marrying. Until that day. I think this is the suddenness. I think this is the imminence of what Amos is saying right here. It's the same tone and tenor that Jesus used. So when the spring crop began to sprout, everything was fine. And with no warning, a locust swarm was forming. The spring crop was after the king's mowing. The government was taking what they needed and what they wanted first. The king's mowing has to do with the government. The northern and southern kingdom could not reap their own crops, well, until Uncle Sam came in and put his hand in their pocket and took out what he wanted. So God warned them that this would be the case. And let me just real quick here, get my Bible here and read you 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 through 17. Matter of fact, we'll go down, let's see, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10, we'll go down to verse 20. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked him of a king. And he said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders in thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. And he will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. So, God told them that would happen. And there's another indication in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 7. I'm just going to go over a few. And Solomon had 12 deputies over all Israel, who provided for the king and his household. Each man had to provide for a month in the year. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 5. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys. Perhaps we will find grass and keep the horses and mules alive and not have to kill some of the cattle." I just wanted to use these few verses to show the pattern of this, well, what went on then and is still going on now. This government free grazing. And God warned his people. He warned them this would be the case, that this would happen. So generations later, the people are still having to stop with what they're doing and comply and pay up. And God had warned humanity then. If you want a king in the manner of government run by man, or in some way a government ran by men adding to God, with God added, this compliance of land pillaging and government, this government free grazing will ensue. So there is lots to learn from these reactions and actions, these cause and effect from the biblical accounts, and particularly here in Amos chapter 7. So we'll begin going through the first few verses in Amos chapter 7 of Amos next week. Till next time.